Your stomach is not the problem. It never was. That's the part nobody tells you. You've been blaming the wrong thing this entire time. Counting calories, cutting carbs, running on a treadmill until your knees ache, and still looking in the mirror at the same stubborn shape that refuses to move. And here's what's strange. In a small fishing town on the coast of Japan, there are people in their 70s with flatter stomachs than most 25-year-olds in the West. Not because they starve, not because they suffer, because somewhere along the way, they never lost something we threw away decades ago. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what that is, and you're going to realize you've been fighting your body instead of listening to it. Picture this. It's just past 6 in the morning in a small town outside Kyoto. The streets are still quiet, mist sitting low over the rooftops. An old woman steps out of her house, bows slightly toward the small shrine at the corner, and begins walking. Not jogging, not sprinting with headphones blaring motivational playlists. Just walking, unhurried, breathing slow through her nose, watching the light change over the rooftops. She'll do this every single morning for the rest of her life. And she has done it for the last 50 years. Nobody told her this was a fat loss protocol. She just calls it living. And that's the first thing that has to break inside your head before anything else makes sense. We've been taught that changing your body requires punishment. Sweat as proof of effort, suffering as proof of discipline. But the people who actually keep a flat stomach into their 70s and 80s never treated their bodies like an enemy to be defeated. They treated it like a garden to be tended, quietly, daily, without drama. That distinction alone is the invisible thread running underneath everything I'm about to show you. 7 small habits. None of them dramatic on their own, but watch how they build on each other, because the last one changes the meaning of everything before it. Let's start small. Almost too small to matter, because that's exactly the point. There's a ritual most Japanese households still hold on to, one that almost nobody outside the culture pays attention to. Before the main dish arrives, there's always something small first. A bowl of miso soup, a few pickled vegetables, something light, warm, often fermented. This isn't decoration, it's sequencing. Eating something fermented in a warm broth before the heavier part of the meal appears to change how the body handles what comes after. Researchers who study meal order have found that starting with fiber and fermented foods is associated with gentler post-meal blood sugar swings. Less of a spike, less of a crash, less of that mid-afternoon fog that sends you reaching for something sweet just to feel normal again. Nobody's claiming miso soup is magic. It's one small variable among many. But small variables, repeated 3 times a day for 60 years, add up into something that looks like magic from the outside. There's something else happening here that has nothing to do with digestion. The pause between courses, soup, then vegetables, then rice, then protein, forces the meal to slow down. You physically cannot rush through a meal built this way. Notice something. This isn't about restriction, it's about order. And order is a much smaller ask than willpower. That's the first piece. Interesting, maybe even a little underwhelming on its own. Stay with it because the next one has more weight behind it. The second habit lives in something almost embarrassingly ordinary. How much fish shows up on a Japanese plate compared to red meat, and how that protein gets spread evenly across the day instead of loaded into one enormous dinner. Here's why that matters more than it sounds like it should. Protein is what your body uses to preserve muscle while it's burning fat, and muscle is metabolically expensive tissue. It costs energy just to exist, even while you're sitting still. Losing muscle alongside fat, which happens easily with crash diets, quietly lowers the very furnace you're trying to keep burning. The type of protein matters too, though the science here is more modest than dramatic headlines suggest. Fish delivers omega-3 fats, and there's a reasonable body of research linking those fats to lower markers of inflammation throughout the body, including in fat tissue itself. Visceral fat, the kind sitting deep around your organs, not just under the skin, behaves differently than fat elsewhere. It produces its own inflammatory signals, and chronic inflammation is one of several factors that can make continued fat loss around the middle harder than it is elsewhere on the body. Omega-3 intake alone won't dissolve that fat, but as one piece, Inside a larger pattern, it appears to tip the chemistry slightly in your favor, meal after meal, year after year. This is usually where people expect a single silver bullet. There isn't one. That's actually the whole point. Let's go a little deeper, because the third habit is where timing starts to matter more than content. Traditional Japanese households tend to eat their final meal early, often finished well before evening winds down, and sleep on a fairly consistent schedule tied to daylight rather than to whatever's still playing on a screen. Here's the part that surprises people. It's not really about the number of hours of sleep, though that matters too. It's about the gap between your last bite of food and your first hour of actual rest. Eating close to bedtime tends to keep insulin elevated during the exact hours your body would otherwise be devoting to repair rather than digestion. Over months, this single habit, eating right before sleep, can quietly work against nearly everything else on this list. Not because one late dinner ruins anything, but because the pattern, repeated night after night, never gives the body a clear signal about when the day has actually ended. This is the part most people get completely wrong. They treat late-night eating as a food problem. It's really a timing problem, and timing problems are invisible until you name them. We're 3 habits in, and so far, none of them required suffering. Just order, just protein choices, just timing. But here's where it starts to get heavier, because the next habit touches something most people have never once questioned. In Okinawa, there's a phrase parents still teach their children, almost like a small prayer whispered before eating. Hara hachi bu. It means eating until you're roughly 80% full. Not stuffed. Not scraping the plate clean out of guilt about wasting food. 80%. Then the chopsticks go down. Here's why that number carries so much weight. Your stomach doesn't send a full signal to your brain instantly. There's a meaningful lag, often cited around 20 minutes, between food reaching your stomach and your brain registering satisfaction. Most people eat straight through that entire window. They keep going because the plate isn't empty yet, because stopping at 80% feels like leaving something on the table. Literally. The Okinawan elders who still practice this aren't restricting themselves in any punishing sense. They're simply giving their brain time to catch up with their stomach. Over decades, that 20% gap compounds into something enormous. Less bloating, less of that heavy, swollen feeling after dinner, a stomach with room to actually digest instead of fighting to process more than it needed. Try imagining your next meal cut by just that fifth. Not a diet, not a rule taped to your fridge. Just a pause, a breath, a small decision to put the chopsticks down slightly earlier than instinct tells you to. 4 habits in, and something should be nagging at you by now. None of these are hacks. They're all forms of the same discipline, worn differently. Watch how the next one takes that discipline somewhere completely unexpected. Japanese culture has an old, quiet devotion to warmth. Specifically, warming the body from the inside through hot baths, ofuro, taken not for cleaning, but for soaking. Often daily, sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes, in water hot enough to make you sweat sitting still. Heat exposure like this raises your core body temperature in a controlled way, which appears to activate a family of proteins called heat shock proteins. Early and ongoing research suggests these proteins may help support healthier blood sugar regulation, and some studies have observed modest, short-lived increases in metabolic rate afterward. It's worth being honest here. This is not a guaranteed fat-burning switch, and the effect size in the research is small compared to what marketing around hot therapy often implies. But small, repeated nightly for decades, inside a life already built around rhythm rather than urgency, becomes part of a much larger pattern. Picture an elderly grandmother sitting quietly in a wooden tub, doing something her family has done for 200 years, still moving through her days with a stomach flatter than half the gym members 20 years younger than her. It's not one bath doing that. It's never having stopped. 5 down. But the 6th is where this entire list stops being about food or water and starts being about something happening inside your nervous system every single day, whether you notice it or not. Cortisol. You've probably heard the word thrown around, usually attached to some warning about stress making you fat. There's truth in that, though the relationship is more nuanced than a single headline can capture. When cortisol stays elevated for long stretches, not for a stressful hour, but for stressful months, sometimes an entire unexamined decade, research suggests the body may begin storing fat differently with a preference toward the abdomen, since visceral fat cells appear to carry more cortisol receptors than fat stored elsewhere. It's one contributing factor among several, not a complete explanation on its own, but it's a factor most people have never once considered when they look in the mirror and blame their diet, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. The belly fat that won't move might not be a food problem at all. It might be a nervous system that's never received a clear signal that it's safe to relax. In Japan, there's a quiet habit built almost directly around interrupting that signal. Shinrin Yoku, forest bathing. Not a hike, not exercise, not calorie burning. The deliberate act of walking slowly through trees, doing nothing else. No phone, no podcast, no pace to hit. Just presence. Studies on the practice have observed measurable drops in cortisol after roughly 20 minutes among trees, along with lowered blood pressure and heart rate in many participants, though responses vary from person to person and the research is still developing. 20 minutes. No sit-ups required. Here's the part that should genuinely stop you. You could be doing everything right. Eating clean, moving daily, sleeping 8 hours, and still be carrying stubborn belly fat because your body has been marinating in stress hormones for years with nowhere to release them. The stomach isn't stubborn. It may simply be listening to a signal you didn't know you were sending. 6 habits in, and each one has been heavier than the last. But the 7th isn't really a habit at all. It's the thing that makes every other habit possible in the first place, and once you see it, you can't unsee it anywhere in this list. There's a word in Japanese ikigai that roughly translates to a reason for being. It's not really about weight or health or fitness in any direct sense. It's about having something that pulls you out of bed each morning that has nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with meaning. A craft, a garden, a grandchild, a small business run the exact same careful way for 40 years. Population studies out of Okinawa, one of the most studied longevity regions on Earth, have found that people who report a strong sense of ikigai also tend to show lower chronic stress markers and, in several long-term studies, somewhat lower rates of abdominal obesity. It's important to say this plainly because the honest version matters more than the dramatic one. Correlation isn't proof of a single cause, and ikigai doesn't burn calories by itself. What it appears to do, at least according to the research available, is remove a certain low-grade chronic anxiety that would otherwise keep cortisol simmering quietly in the background of an unexamined life. And there it is. The circle closes. The nervous system that needed to feel safe, the cortisol that needed somewhere to settle. The reason ikigai matters isn't that it's a magic 7th ingredient stacked on top of 6 others. It's that ikigai is often the reason the other 6 habits exist at all. A person who has something worth getting up for doesn't need to rush through a meal, doesn't need to eat standing over a sink at 10 at night, doesn't need a stomach that stays braced for a threat that never actually arrives because the threat was never really food. It was always the absence of something to hold on to. There's a scene that plays out almost identically in small towns across Japan, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Late afternoon, a shopkeeper closing for a couple of hours in the middle of the day, not because business is slow, but because that's simply when the shop closes. No apology. No guilt about lost revenue. The rhythm of the day was decided decades ago, long before profit became the only variable that mattered, and nobody's rewritten it since. Compare that to the version most of us are living. Lunch eaten at a desk, one hand on a sandwich, the other still typing. Dinner reheated in a microwave at 9 at night because the day never actually ended. It just quietened down enough to notice you hadn't eaten. Sleep treated as the thing you do after everything else is finished, rather than a fixed appointment your body can rely on. None of this is really about Japan. It's about what happens to a body that's never allowed to predict its own day. Your stomach, your hormones, your metabolism. All of it seems to respond to rhythm, to pattern, to a nervous system being able to guess roughly what's coming next. Wake, eat, move, rest, sleep, repeat, in a shape stable enough that the body stops bracing for chaos. Strip that predictability away, and the body tends to respond the way it's built to. It holds on, it protects, it stores. This is usually where people expect a warning about willpower. There isn't one coming. Willpower was never the missing ingredient because willpower is a finite resource you burn through by lunchtime if your whole day is spent fighting your own environment. The old woman walking at dawn isn't using more willpower than you have. She's simply not fighting anything. Her environment and her body agreed on the terms decades ago. That's the quiet reframe sitting underneath all 7 habits. You don't need more discipline stacked onto an already exhausting life. You need fewer things to resist in the first place. So here's the honest, unglamorous truth waiting at the end of all this, without the dramatic packaging. Start with the small ritual of a warm soup before the heavier food. Choose fish a little more often than red meat. Finish dinner earlier and give your body a real gap before sleep. Put the chopsticks down at 80% instead of 100. Sit in warm water without rushing. Spend 20 quiet minutes somewhere green without producing anything. And somewhere in all of it, look for the thing that pulls you forward each morning that has nothing to do with fear. None of this is guaranteed to work the same way for every single body. That's simply honest. But small, repeatable, unglamorous habits, practiced for decades instead of weeks, appear again and again in the research on the people who age with the flattest stomachs and the calmest nervous systems on record. Small, repeatable, almost boring if you're being honest. And that might be exactly why it works, and why the version sold to you, dramatic, urgent, expensive, never quite does. Go back to that image from the very beginning. The old woman stepping outside just past 6 in the morning, bowing slightly at the small shrine on the corner, walking slowly into the mist. It looked like nothing was happening. No sweat, no suffering, no proof of effort anywhere in sight. But everything was happening. Just quietly, the way real change almost always does.